The scene was horrific, and the robotic staff were doing what they could, but they were still short. This medbay was just not meant to handle so many at once. Mouse had to do something. She had to make up for what she had failed to do before, to atone in at least some way for failing to protect the others on the Woklinde, even if it wasn't enough. If this had been a hospital, Mouse would have gone to the worst cases first, but this wasn't. This was a medical bay on a ship in the middle of space, and the event they had just been through was much closer to a war than a tragic incident. As much as she hated the thought, she would have to find the case most likely to pull through. Glancing over everyone in the halls, her attention was drawn to the chemical exposure victim. Acid was nasty and painful, but usually mostly cosmetic. As long as the Felicia's body could handle whatever chemical had been spilled, and it hadn't gotten anywhere vital, she should pull through. Mouse made her way quickly to the gurney the Marine was writhing on, reaching out a hand to steady the body in its rocking so she wouldn't fall off. But something stopped her. Suddenly, it was as if she could see something worse than the acid burns and horrid stench. Tendrils seemed to writhe beneath the Felicia's skin, like maggots furiously feeding beneath the flesh. However, when she focused, no such thing was actually happening. Still, she felt an intense disgust well inside her, and a realization seemed to raise to the fore of her mind. What that realization was, she couldn't quite tell, but she found herself looking around her in a crawling panic, like one would feel if they had just realized their room was filling with cockroaches at the others around her. The other wounded writhed and moaned and screamed, those that were capable of it. Some few just lay curled in on themselves and bared long, slender canines, in too much pain to do anything but keep breathing. For all that Mouse was suddenly filled with an atavastic dread, she could see nothing out of the ordinary about any of the women in various states of trauma around her. The one on the gurney beside Mouse, however, seemed to realize that something was amiss. She lay still now, staring up at the silver-haired woman, and as soon as Mouse's eyes were off of her, she reached up cat-quick to grab Mouse's wrist. Her skin was hot, too hot, and clammy, and static made the Felicia's short fur hair stand up on the back of her arm. Skin to skin was much worse, like someone touching an aluminum wire to her mental fillings, and Mouse's skin crawled with the feeling of 1,000 hot, slimy, turgid fingers being dragged across her spine, her cheeks, her neck. She could, for the barest of moments, hear a high-pitched whining noise that reminded her of a dentist drill, and smell ash and ozone and heated copper. Then the Felicia drew her hand back as though she'd been burned, hissing through half-melted lips and staring at Mouse with eyes that were a luminous green. Mouse's eyes widened, questions, fear, and confusion filling her at the sight. And what on earth had that been? What was wrong with this Marine? I know, came the cool thought from the deeper place in Mouse's mind that had for some reason become more active of late, and Mouse felt a cruel calm come over her. Such disgusting creatures, she said, eyes narrowing as she stared into those unnaturally lit pupils. And here I thought I had rid myself of you. Her hand reached out again, this time more certain, more delicate in motion, but all the same more deadly. It came to rest on the Felicia's forehead, fingers clamping down hard as to not be jostled free, and Mouse felt a strange surge of power. It flowed through her arm and focused at her palm, something solid forming there and thrusting itself through the Felicia's skull with a crunch and a squelch. The Felicia jolted once, convulsing sharply, and her teeth snapped in a purely animal reaction, missing Mouse's wrist by centimeters. Then she was still, stone dead, and she fell limply to the gurney with a muted thump. As Mouse pulled her hand away, the shadow beneath her palm seemed darker and stickier, lingering for just a bare fraction of a second too long. There was no immediately visible damage to mark the whatever it was that Mouse had just managed, but a closer look with her enhanced vision presented a hole the size of a large needle among the burns. A quick glance around the hall showed Mouse no signs of being noticed, and it was unlikely that the corpsman would even realize she was dead for several more minutes. There would be no danger in leaving or staying as she chose. She could feed. Mouse frowned with the odd thought. What the hell was going on around here? What had that Felicia done to her? It's no matter. Best to keep moving. There was a bit of urgency with the thought, and Mouse decided it was best to continue to try and help where she could. But what else could she do? Her medical knowledge was somewhat limited, and her access to medical tools even more so. Could always comfort the dying. Yes, that was a good idea. Even if there was nothing she could do to save them, perhaps she could at least help their passing a little. Mouse scanned the gurneys in the hallway again, spotting one of the more damaged Felicias, and heading over to her. She sat on the edge, a hand coming out to stroke her blood-soaked hair and fur, even as she gurgled and gasped, her body shivering with pain and agony. Her lungs were filling with fluid, Mouse suddenly realized, and that smell from the wound in her gut. Even if she didn't drown lying on dry ground, the sepsis would get her in a matter of days. The Felicia tensed at the unexpected touch, and the noise she made was a childlike sound of pain and fear, unable to comprehend what was happening to her. Her great golden eyes streamed as she looked up at Mouse, and her felid features were terrified. She nuzzled into the hand stroking her bloody fur, craving the simple human comfort of not dying alone, and Mouse obliged her, smoothing the matted gray locks and brushing away the worst debris and snarls. With every pass of her hand, the Felicia grew more and more quiescent, relaxing fractionally as Mouse repeated the same simple, comforting motions. It was only a minute before she teetered on the edge of oblivion, for if she passed out now she would not wake, but she didn't hurt anymore, and that simple fact filled her with gratitude for the woman sitting above her. She stared up at Mouse with something like awe for a few seconds, still trembling but now from fatigue and blood loss rather than pain, and then the light went out of her eyes as she slipped away. Mouse ceased her strokes and gave a sigh. There was a strange feeling of satisfaction that filled her, though she told herself it was because she had finally managed to do some good, to relieve some pain. However, there was still something that bothered her. She felt stronger now, more confident. Her usual internal thoughts didn't seem as relevant anymore. Then again, that might have just been because she was able to distract herself with the situation around her. She stood, looking again and finding that most of the others were at least somewhat stable. Mouse made her way into the infirmary itself. If the hallway was grim, the infirmary itself was nightmarish. All 15 beds were taken up by Felicias, and it was obvious, even to Mouse's untrained eye, that most of them were going to die. The bed nearest the door held a lump of meat that was barely recognizable as a person, much less a woman and a bioroid, with most of her skin flayed off, as if she'd been grated. Both arms were missing above the elbow, and her legs were badly broken, the left one in 4 places. Past her there was another, her chest cavity torn open as if something had hooked into her ribs and pulled, still clinging to life. But there was nothing to be done for her. A third had a meter of battle steel, a long, jagged splinter 3 fingers wide of what looked like a support strut piercing her from front to back just above her navel. All around her it was the same. They were screaming, whimpering, bleeding, dying. Mouse was at a loss for what to do, how to even comfort them. Then, the flayed one turned over and looked at her. Nacreous light shining in the wet, ruined holes that used to be her eyes, and in a dreadful voice hissed, "We know you, Opener." Mouse's eyes widened in horror, and her fingers twitched uncertainly near the grip of the pistol at her hip. It should be dead. It should be dead. Or if not dead, at least unable to speak, to move, especially not like that. And those eyes. Gods, what was going on here? What the hell had they brought back from that ship? Please, she begged, though she didn't know what to. She wanted to wake up from this nightmare, wanted that calm. Where was that cooling feeling that she had come over her before, when she first saw the Felicia unit out in the hall with the glowing eyes? Something smiled. It had no form, but Mouse could feel it. The tugging of lips just behind her ear at the base of her head, like someone was hovering over her shoulder. Before she could glance over, however, that calm she had desired returned, and the smile she felt at her shoulder grew over her own features. "Yes," she said simply. "It would be best that this be over. Everyone is in just so much pain, aren't they?" Mouse closed her eyes, her back straightening and taking in a deep breath of the sickening metallic air. The screams and wails in the infirmary grew even louder, if that was possible. Shrieks of pain and anger being pulled from them, those infected turning to snarl at her with those glowing orbs as the life was stripped away from all living beings in the room. One by one the mangled Felicias fell quiet. When the room was finally completely bereft of humanoid sounds, Mouse shuddered. She let out a heavy breath, eyes finally opening and her hands coming up to run over her ribs and chest up to her shoulders. She felt good. The silver-haired Russian had returned to herself, though she stared at the bloodied floor with an oddly pleasant numbness before giving a small, distant smile. She felt stronger, her tormented thoughts had quieted, and most of all, she felt powerful. The pain of the others was now gone. This was a good thing. Yes, good that their pain was gone. Though, really, their pain hadn't been so terrible, she supposed. With that distant smile lingering, Mouse turned and walked out of the room, not really even noticing the level of carnage she had just turned away from, or the still agonizing patients in the hallway. The Evil Within was a cooperatively written piece by Elaine Gregor and Walter Wigglesworth.